Today is February 20th, 2023. We are fast approaching the 1-year mark for Russia's special military operation in Ukraine, and I want to talk about that. But before I get into that, I want to talk about what is happening on the ground in Ukraine right now. So as always, let's go to liveuamap.com. It is a pro-Ukrainian live map. And if we zoom in, we are going to notice as usual, there is fighting all along the line of contact in the Donbas region, and it is especially heavy around Bakhmut. And you can see how the encirclement continues to develop. Russian forces are pushing along the south and the north. There are two, what Alexander Mikuris has been calling pincers in his updates on Ukraine every day. And indeed, that's what we see developing. But if we look at Soledar right here, we can see how much control and consolidation Russia has achieved around Soledar. And they're not only moving to the west, north of Bakhmut to encircle the city there, they are also moving north toward Seversk. We can see several salients developing in the direction toward Seversk, including here from Kremenna. Now from Kremenna, if you look back a week or so, if we go to the time feature here on liveuamap.com and we go back to the beginning of February, you will see that even this pro-Ukrainian map is admitting that Russia is making progress in this direction. Now this is rolling back. This is not just Russia continuing to secure the Donbas region. This is Russian forces also rolling back the results of Ukraine's Kharkov offensive back at the mid to end of last year. If you are following the Duran, Alex Christoforou and Alexander Mikuris, who do excellent updates every single day regarding Ukraine and many other geopolitical topics, you are going to hear them mentioning a growing number of admissions across the West that the West is out of weapons. They are out of ammunition to send to Ukraine. There's articles like this from Bloomberg: Ukraine to receive fewer tanks from allies than promised. And they're talking about all of these several hundred Western main battle tanks that were promised and how it doesn't look like that's actually going to happen. I wouldn't bet on it, but it seems like it is much more difficult than they initially imagined. It says German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius indicated that Western allies are struggling to put together 2 full battalions of Leopard 2 tanks to send to Ukraine as promised. Germany and Portugal are the only 2 nations to commit to sending the A6 version of the Leopard 2, with 14 pledged by the government in Berlin and 3 from the Portuguese. Pistorius told reporters Wednesday after meeting NATO counterparts in Brussels, "We will not reach the size of a battalion," he said. Poland has assembled about 30 units of the older A4 version of the Leopard 2, which is almost enough for the standard Ukrainian battalion of 31, but many are in poor condition and need repairs before they can be deployed. Those tanks will only get to Ukraine at the end of April, he added. End of April, the earliest, I would probably add. Then you have articles like this. And what we're seeing is not just the proxy war unraveling, but the narrative surrounding it also unraveling. So this is from Forbes. This is February 16th, 2023. Ukraine is going to run out of T-64 tanks. And the article is talking about how this is Ukraine's primary main battle tank. And the article claims the Ukrainian army went to war with around 800 active T-64 tanks. In the 11 months since Russia widened its attack on Ukraine, the Ukrainians have lost around half of the 40-ton, 3-person T-64s. And I'm going to say that the number is obviously much, much higher than half. They have lost way more than half. I would say most. They have lost most. And this same article is claiming that Russia has lost 1,500 tanks and Ukraine has only lost 400. But that doesn't make sense because they're claiming they've lost at least 400 T-64s alone. They've received hundreds of T-72s from NATO members who had Soviet-era tanks. So they sent all of their T-72s to Ukraine, and Ukraine has lost most of those. They also had their own number of T-80 tanks, and so they have lost obviously way more than 400 tanks. And they're claiming that in addition to only losing 400, they've actually captured 500 Russian tanks, which is where you get claims like this. So this was an article also from Forbes, actually the same writer. The Ukrainian army has more tanks now than when the war began because it keeps capturing them from Russia. And this was from March 2022. And so the narrative just isn't adding up. Nothing about it makes sense. You're not sending Ukraine Western main battle tanks. They have no real ability to operate effectively or maintain or sustain on the battlefield. You're not doing that if Ukraine has only lost 400 tanks in total, has at least 400 T-64s still around, plus hundreds of T-72s. The reality here is not adding up, and you can see even in these newer articles. This newer article is telling you that they're running out of tanks, but they're still repeating war propaganda from months ago that obviously couldn't possibly be true, and this also being true. So again, it is the proxy war unraveling and the narrative surrounding it also unraveling. And the narrative should be easier to hold together than the actual proxy war itself, but it seems like they're having trouble doing even that. And this problem that Ukraine and its Western sponsors face regarding weapons, this applies across the board, not just tanks. We have this from the Drive Ukraine Situation Report. UK to give Kiev longer range weapons. And then it says exactly what long range weapon system remains unknown, but the UK states it is the first country to commit such a capability to Ukraine. The article also says British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak said his country would be the first country to provide Ukraine with longer range weapons. Sunak said there must be a military strategy for Ukraine to gain a decisive advantage on the battlefield to win the war, and a political strategy to win the peace. But there's literally no way for the UK to do this, or any other country in the West by themselves or combined. There's no way for them to do this. Even if the UK, the US, the rest of NATO sends Ukraine longer range weapons, this is not going to give them, what did they call it? A decisive advantage on the battlefield, because Russia already has longer range weapons. Longer range weapons than anything the West could transfer over to Ukraine. So at best, they would be giving Ukraine capabilities that Russia already has. This is not going to give them an advantage. It's going to drag everything out longer and get more people killed. The same article says, NBC News reported Saturday that the US intelligence believes China may be providing non-lethal military aid to Russia's war in Ukraine, with fears growing that could soon evolve into direct lethal aid. CNN reporter Natasha Bertrand later tweeted a similar report, noting that the US has shared this intelligence with its allies at the Munich Security Conference. Now, I pointed out how this is a US proxy war on Russia using Ukraine. I've also talked about how this is just a smaller part of a much wider US foreign policy objective to encircle and contain all peer and near peer competitors, not just Russia, but also China. And the US is using a very similar strategy against China, using China's island of Taiwan and encouraging separatism there, and trying to turn this into another armed conflict by proxy, just like they've done in Ukraine versus Russia. It's very obvious to China that if Russia were to fail in Ukraine, the US succeeds in dividing, destroying Russia, that's going to leave China all by itself, and that's going to allow the West to then pivot toward China and put all of its attention and put all of its resources in a very concentrated way on China. They know that. And besides that, and I've talked about this in other videos, and I've invited experts on to explain why Russia and China are already close allies for many different reasons. And this threat the US poses to both of them just gives them one additional reason to work close together. And I'm going to get into what the US is doing specifically to threaten China later, and it'll become very clear why China would be interested in helping Russia, the necessity also for China to help Russia. And as a matter of fact, the media right now, the Western media, is talking about how a representative from the Pentagon traveled to Taiwan without Beijing's approval. And this is at the same time when, if you go to the US State Department's website, they say in black and white, they don't recognize Taiwan's independence. They don't recognize or support it. And if Taiwan is not an independent country, and if the US recognizes the one China policy, there's only one China, including Taiwan. The government of China is the People's Republic of China in Beijing, then they are blatantly violating China's sovereignty over Taiwan. They're doing that very deliberately. So it doesn't take a lot of imagination to understand why China would be helping Russia and why it's perfectly acceptable for China to help Russia. Let's talk about Russia's special military operation. 1 year on, we're 1 year into the special military operation. We hear the US government repeatedly referring to this as Russia's war of choice, Russia's war of aggression. They claim that it was unprovoked. There's no reason for Russia to do this. We hear all kinds of people, ordinary people, all the way up to people in Western governments claiming that Russia has imperial intentions. That is why they're in Ukraine. I am going to demolish all of these claims by explaining exactly why Russia went into Ukraine, what preceded all of this. We all see where we are right now. We're wondering where we're going to go in the near future. I'm going to show you what started all of this. To begin with, let's just point out the fact that Russia didn't start a war in February last year. It intervened into the middle of an ongoing war. And as a matter of fact, we have documents like this from the United Nations Human Rights Office of the High Commissioner, and they talk about conflict-related civilian casualties in Ukraine. This is January 2022, so this is before the special military operation began, and it says they estimate the total number of conflict-related casualties in Ukraine from the 14th of April 2014, so that's quite a bit earlier than February 2022, to December 2021, to be between 51,000 and 54,000. That includes around 14,000 killed, which includes 3,000 civilians, 3,400 civilians, 4,400 Ukrainian forces, and 6,500 members of militia groups in the Donbas region. Over 14,000 killed, and over 3,000 of them civilians. That sounds like a war was already well underway by the time Russia intervened in 2022. Now, we all know after Russia launched its special military operation, they've taken large parts of Kherson and Zaporozhye. They're working on taking all of Donetsk. They have almost all of Lugansk. We see what's going on. We see where we are right now, where the West is out of weapons, out of ammunition for Ukraine. Ukrainian forces are losing ground around Bakhmut, Kremenna, and in other areas. And we see Russia having mobilized its forces and ramping up its military industrial output. And we see the West unable to do anything to counter this. And we're waiting to see exactly how all of this plays out. But we're going to hear a lot of people at this 1 year mark say, look, this has been going on for 1 year, and Russia thought they were going to take over Ukraine in just 3 days. They didn't expect it to last this long. But if you've been watching my updates over the last year, you will remember me reading transcripts from the US Department of Defense where Pentagon representatives admitted that no, Russia was prepared for this. They were well aware that this would become a protracted, drawn-out, large-scale, and intense combat operation. They knew this. That's why they assembled huge amounts of men, equipment, and ammunition on the borders of Ukraine because they knew it was going to last long. They hoped to get it over with as quickly as possible, but they were well aware that the probability of doing that was very low, and the probability of having to fight a long-term, protracted, intense, large-scale conflict, that was most likely going to happen, and they were well prepared for it, which is why we see what we're seeing in Ukraine right now. And Russia is going to continue fighting for as long as it takes to remove the national security threat the US deliberately placed on Russia's doorstep. For all of the people who are going to try to label this as a Russian war of aggression, a war of choice, Russia with its imperial intentions, I just want to point out how not only did Russia not start a war, they intervened into the middle of an ongoing one. This was a response to a very deliberate effort by the US to use Ukraine as a national security threat aimed directly at Russia. First of all, we have to keep in mind NATO. What has NATO been doing for the last couple of decades now, really? They've been expanding eastward. Now, what is NATO? NATO claims that it's a defensive alliance, but since the turn of the century, since the beginning of the 21st century, the last 23 years, what has NATO done? They have invaded and destroyed one country after the other. Sometimes literally in NATO's name itself, but oftentimes the membership of NATO doing it in a separate coalition, but they're all more or less NATO members. So we've seen the US invade Afghanistan in 2001, Iraq in 2003. They intervened militarily in Libya in 2011, and from 2011 onward, the US has been involved through a war of proxy and also a direct invasion and occupation of Syria. And they have been involved in proxy conflicts elsewhere all around the world. In each and every case, these serial wars of aggression, the US and the rest of NATO predicated this military aggression on fabricated, deliberate lies. So just for an example, Iraq, weapons of mass destruction. They knew there were no weapons of mass destruction. It was a deliberate lie to justify a war of aggression they sought out to wage. And we all remember U.S. Army General Wesley Clark talking about his time at the Pentagon and seeing plans in the Pentagon for U.S. invasions in all of these countries. And, well, he explains it.
I went through the Pentagon 10 days after 9/11. I couldn't stay away from Mother Army. I went back there to see Don Rumsfeld. I'd worked for him as a White House fellow in the 1970s. All this is in the book. And I said, am I doing okay on CNN? He said, yeah, fine. He said, I'm thinking about it. He says, I read your book. And he said, this is a book that talks about the Kosovo campaign. And he said, I just want to tell you, he said, nobody's going to tell us where or when we can bomb. Nobody. He said, I'm thinking of calling this a floating coalition. What do you think about that? I said, well, sir, thanks for reading my book. And, he said, thanks, that's all the time I've got. Really. And I went downstairs. I was leaving the Pentagon, and an officer from the Joint Staff called me into his office and said, I want you to know, he said, sir, we're going to attack Iraq. And I said, why? He said, we don't know. He said, I said, well, did they tie Saddam to 9/11? He said, no. And then I came back to the Pentagon about 6 weeks later. I saw the same officer. I said, why haven't we attacked Iraq? We still going to attack Iraq? He said, oh, sir. He says, it's worse than that. He said, he pulled up a piece of paper off his desk. He said, I just got this memo from the Secretary of Defense's office. It says we're going to attack and destroy the governments in 7 countries in 5 years. We're going to start with Iraq, and then we're going to move to Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Iran. I said, 7 countries in 5 years. I said, is that a classified memo? He said, yes, sir. I said, well, don't show it to me. He was about to show it to me. He said, because I want to talk about it. And I sat on this information for a long time, for about 6 or 8 months. I was so stunned by this, I couldn't begin to talk about it. And I couldn't believe it would really be true, but that's actually what happened. These people took control of the policy in the United States. And I realized then, it came back to me, a 1991 meeting I had with Paul Wolfowitz. You know, in 2001, he was Deputy Secretary of Defense, but in 1991, he was the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. It's the #3 position in the Pentagon. And I had gone to see him when I was a one-star general. I was commanding the National Training Center. I had met him one time. He said, if you ever get to Washington, come look me up. They always say that. Well, I was there in Washington. It was a Friday afternoon. I'd visited Colin Powell. He'd given me 5 minutes of his precious time and sent me on my way, and I was bored in the Pentagon, and I thought, I'll just go, who can I see? I think I'll see Wolfowitz. So I called, and up there, he was available. Scooter Libby came to the door. I met Scooter for the first time, and he brought me in, and I said to Paul, I said, and this is 1991, I said, Mr. Secretary, you must be pretty happy with the performance of the troops in Desert Storm. And he said, well, yeah, he said, but not really. He said, because the truth is we should have gotten rid of Saddam Hussein, and we didn't. And this was just after the Shia uprising in March of '91, which we had provoked, and then we kept our troops on the sidelines and didn't intervene. And he said, but one thing we did learn, he said, we learned that we can use our military in the region, in the Middle East, and the Soviets won't stop us. He said, and we've got about 5 or 10 years to clean up those old Soviet client regimes, Syria, Iran, Iraq, before the next great superpower comes on to challenge us. And it was like, you know, I'm coming out of the Mojave Desert. I've been training troops. I haven't been thinking geostrategy for some time. And suddenly a guy just sort of shoves this nugget at you. Well, you remember it. It was a pretty stunning thing. You mean the purpose of the military is to start wars and change governments? It's not to sort of deter conflict? We're going to invade countries? And, you know, my mind was spinning. And I put that aside. It was like a nugget that you hold on to. This country was taken over by a group of people with a policy coup. Wolfowitz and Cheney and Rumsfeld, and you could name a half dozen other collaborators from the Project for a New American Century. They wanted us to destabilize the Middle East, turn it upside down, make it under our control. It went back to those comments in 1991. Now, did anybody ever tell you that? Was there a national dialogue on this? Did senators and congressmen stand up and denounce this plan? Was there a full-fledged American debate on it? Absolutely not. And there still isn't. And that's why we're failing in Iraq. Because Iran and Syria know about the plan. All you have to do is read the Weekly Standard and listen to Bill Kristol, and he blabbermouths it all over the world. Richard Pearl the same way. They could hardly wait to finish Iraq so they could move into Syria.
So the idea was to assert U.S. hegemony over the planet, to take out any country that could potentially be an ally for a re-emerging Russia, but also a rising China, so that the U.S. can maintain hegemony over the planet. It had nothing to do with self-preservation or national security interests back in the United States itself. As NATO is carrying out all of these wars of aggression around the world, destroying one nation after the other, again, predicated on absolute lies, the alliance itself continues expanding right up to Russia's border, this constant expansion eastward. And a lot of people will say, well, these nations are choosing out of their own free will to join NATO. So what's wrong with that? Well, what's wrong with that is they aren't picking to join NATO out of their own free will. The United States is going into these countries, interfering politically, overthrowing countries that have no interest in NATO, and installing client regimes that will join NATO, or at least show interest in joining NATO. So let's look at what the Western media has to say about this process of the U.S. interfering in all of these countries right up to Russia's doorstep. So let's start with the year 2000. New York Times, who really brought down Milosevic? And they're talking about Serbia, and they're talking about this opposition group called OTPAR. OTPAR. And this is what it says. American assistance to OTPAR and the 18 parties that ultimately ousted Milosevic is still a highly sensitive subject. But Paul McCarthy, An official with the Washington-based National Endowment for Democracy is ready to divulge some details. McCarthy sits in Belgrade's central Moskva hotel, enjoying the satisfaction of being in a country that had long been off limits to him under Milosevic. Now, the National Endowment for Democracy, in name alone, is a contradiction. Democracy is a process of self-determination. So if the United States is interfering in any way in that process, then the outcome is something being determined by Washington, not of the nation itself that is being interfered in. If the U.S. is interfering in another nation's internal political affairs, for example, pumping money into opposition groups, favoring one opposition group over another, what is that? That is just blatant political interference. That is not democracy promotion. But that is what the National Endowment for Democracy does. And listen to what the New York Times says about McCarthy. He's in Belgrade. He wouldn't have been able to enjoy doing the things he wanted to do in Serbia under the Milosevic government, and now he can. And that's a microcosm of what the U.S. is doing around the world in general. There are things they want to do inside these sovereign countries. As sovereign nations, they say, no, you cannot do that. This is our country. We decide what happens here. So they overthrow the government. They put a new one in that will let them do whatever they want. That is what this whole process, being explained by the New York Times, that is how this whole process goes. The New York Times explains in pretty good detail about how all of this went. And you just listen and you tell me if the final result was an organic protest of the Serbian people just wanting freedom and democracy, and if it isn't just foreign interference sponsored by the U.S. government. This is what the article says. Just how much money backed this objective is not clear. The United States Agency for International Development, USAID, says that $25 million was appropriated just this year. Several $100,000 were given directly to OPAR for demonstration support material like t-shirts and stickers, says Donald Presley, the assistant administrator. OPAR leaders intimate they also received a lot of covert aid, a subject on which there is no comment in Washington. And I've covered this for years and years. In articles I used to write and now in videos about how the U.S. does this in absolutely every country. Go to the National Endowment for Democracy's website, click on where we work, and take a look at where they're doing this political interference. This is worldwide. It goes on and it says, at the International Republican Institute, another non-governmental Washington group financed partly by AID, an official named Daniel Caligate says he met OPAR leaders 7 to 10 times in Hungary and Montenegro beginning in October 1999. So the U.S. government was meeting with these opposition groups and building them up before the movement even took to the streets. Some of the $1.8 million the Institute spent in Serbia in the last year was provided direct to OPAR. He says by this fall, OPAR was no ramshackle students group. It was a well-oiled movement backed by several $1 million from the United States. It wasn't a student group at all. It was a proxy force created by the United States posing as a student group. That's what it is. Now, can you honestly say that a government that results from this type of complete political interference by the United States, that a government resulting from this process is capable of making decisions reflecting that government, that country's best interests, or that it is making sovereign decisions, or is it the government resulting from this process is a proxy and it's simply doing whatever the United States tells it to do, lest it suffer a similar fate? That's just in Serbia. Where else does the Western media admit that they're doing this exact same process? Look at this article from The Guardian. U.S. campaign behind the turmoil in Kiev. And this isn't 2014, this is 2004. So the U.S. has been meddling in Ukraine for a very long time. What does The Guardian say about this? While the gains of the orange-bedecked chestnut revolution are Ukraine's, The campaign is an American creation, so then it's not. It's Washington's. A sophisticated and brilliantly conceived exercise in Western branding and mass marketing that in 4 countries in 4 years has been used to try to salvage rigged elections and topple unsavory regimes. Well, so says Washington. That just sounds like an excuse for Washington to topple other people's political systems and rig their elections in their favor. It goes on and it says, funded and organized by the U.S. government, deploying U.S. consultancies, pollsters, diplomats, and 2 big American parties, and U.S. non-government organizations. The campaign was first used in Europe in Belgrade in 2000 to beat Slobodan Milosevic at the ballot box. Richard Miles, the U.S. ambassador in Belgrade, played a key role. So they overthrew the government in Serbia. The U.S. interfered. They built up an opposition that otherwise would never have taken power, and they toppled the government in Serbia. Then it says, and by last year, as U.S. ambassador in Tbilisi, he repeated the trick in Georgia, coaching Mikhail Saakashvili in how to bring down his opponent. 10 months after the success in Belgrade, the U.S. ambassador in Minsk, a veteran of similar operations in Central America, notably Nicaragua, organized a near-identical campaign to try to defeat the Belarus hardman Alexander Lukashenko. And of course, they've been doing this in Russia itself. Blatant political interference and attempted regime change. That one failed. But experience gained in Serbia, Georgia, and Belarus has been invaluable in plotting to beat the regime in Kiev. The operation, engineering democracy through the ballot box and civil disobedience, is now so slick that the methods have matured in a template for winning other people's elections. So that right there gives up the whole game. The U.S. is trying to win other people's elections. They'll claim that the elections are unfair when it doesn't produce the results the United States wants to see, but they will go in there and they will manipulate the process until they get the outcome they want. And so this is not democracy and self-determination. This is political meddling. This is all being determined by Washington and for Washington. And so this Guardian article is not just admitting that the U.S. was meddling heavily in Ukraine, but it's confirming what the New York Times said about Serbia. It's also throwing in Georgia and Belarus as also targets of U.S. political interference. And I want to point out this video clip from the Atlantic Council, which is a U.S. government-funded think tank, and this is Damon Wilson, and he explains how all of this change he wants to see in Eastern Europe, Central Asia, all of this change he wants to see, eventually he wants to see this change in Russia.
The aim is to anchor a vulnerable, insecure zone in the certainty of a stable and prosperous and free Europe. And over the long term, this vision includes a democratic Russia. But the pathway to reform in Moscow might just begin with choices that are made in Kiev, Chisinau, Yerevan, and Tbilisi.
That is what Russia is faced with. A violent, coercive, supposed defensive alliance destroying one nation after the other, also expanding up to Russia's border, and also carrying out regime change in the last few countries that haven't joined NATO, and then getting those regimes to also seek NATO membership. And the whole point is to isolate Russia, weaken Russia, so that regime change can take place in Russia itself. It's the existence of Russia as a sovereign state that is at stake here. And it is the United States driving this entire process. One thing that I want to point out that makes this even worse is the fact that not only did we see The Guardian admit the U.S. government meddled in Georgia, overthrew the government there, put a client regime into power, we know that afterwards, the U.S. began pouring military weapons and training into Georgia. And then in 2008, there was a war. And we always hear this war referred to as Russia's invasion into Georgia. But in actuality, even according to the Western media, this is Reuters, Georgia started war with Russia, EU-backed report. So the EU investigated this, and they found that it was Georgia that started this war in 2008. It says an independent report blamed Georgia for starting last year's 5-day war with Russia. It also says none of the explanations given by the Georgian authorities in order to provide some form of legal justification for the attack lent it a valid explanation. Saakashvili had said Georgia, Saakashvili being the client regime installed into power by U.S. meddling, he said that Georgia was responding to an invasion by Russian forces when it attacked breakaway South Ossetia, but the report found no evidence of this. So the U.S. overthrew the government of Georgia, put a client regime in power, armed it, trained them militarily, and then they invaded and attacked Russia. And now they've done the exact same thing in Ukraine. And I'm going to get to Ukraine here in just a minute. They overthrew the government of Ukraine. They put a client regime, a very anti-Russian client regime, into power. Then they started flooding Ukraine with weapons, training them militarily. What is Russia supposed to do? Wait for Ukraine, a much larger country in terms of physical size, population, and military power, wait until they've attacked Russia and killed Russians? Or should they, knowing exactly what the U.S. is trying to do, should they try to stop this before it's too late, before Ukraine is militarized and NATOized to the point where Russia will have a serious problem dealing with the threat that Ukraine poses to Russian national security, demonstrably poses to Russian national security, because Georgia already demonstrated that these U.S. NATO-backed client regimes are dangerous and will carry out military aggression against Russia. So The Guardian admits in 2004 the U.S. was meddling in Ukraine. What happened in 2014, 2013, 2014, it was just a replay of what The Guardian was explaining the U.S. government did in Ukraine then. Before I get into the actual protests themselves, this is from 2013. This is then U.S. Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland at an event admitting that the United States government has poured billions of dollars, billions with a B, into Ukraine's internal political affairs.
Since Ukraine's independence in 1991, the United States has supported Ukrainians as they build democratic skills and institutions, as they promote civic participation and good governance, all of which are preconditions for Ukraine to achieve its European aspirations. We've invested over $5 billion to assist Ukraine in these and other goals that will ensure a secure and prosperous and democratic Ukraine.
And again, just imagine if Russia or China were pouring billions of dollars into America's political system, how that would be perceived. That would be perceived as interference, because it is interference. Well, this is what the U.S. is admittedly doing in Ukraine for years and years. Since its independence from Russia, or the Soviet Union and Russia, that's what the U.S. has been doing, pouring money into its political system to exercise control over it. Then talking about the protests themselves, this is from Channel 4 News, UK. Far-right group at heart of Ukraine protests meet U.S. senator. Isn't that nice? There's a U.S. senator in Kiev during the anti-government protests on stage with Nazis, Ukrainian Nazis, and then behind the scenes also meeting with them and talking with them. And the article says, Ukraine's pro-EU protests show no sign of stopping. U.S. Senator John McCain dined with opposition leaders this weekend, including the extreme far-right Svoboda Party. During his trip, the former U.S. presidential candidate met with government and opposition figures, but gave his endorsement to the pro-Europe protesters. Senator McCain later waved to protesters from the stage in Independence Square during a mass rally in Kiev, standing with Ola Tianabo, leader of the anti-Semitic Svoboda Party. And, anti-Semitic is just a roundabout way of saying they're Nazis. They are Nazis. So that's what the U.S. was doing during the protests. Victoria Nuland herself was also out on the streets in Kiev as part of the protests. So this was not just backed by the U.S., but the U.S. had people on the ground literally participating in the streets in these protests, and U.S. senators on stage during the protests. Again, just imagine if it was the other way around, if it was Russian or Chinese representatives on a protest stage in the U.S. How would that be perceived by the U.S.? Or if they were in Canada doing this to set up an anti-American regime right on America's border, how would the U.S. react to that? We could only imagine. And then, most damning of all, and this is, reported by Western media. This is the BBC, British state media. Victoria Nuland, leaked call shows U.S. hand on Ukraine. Down here it says, swearing scornfully about your allies isn't great diplomacy, but it's the revelation of the depth of the US involvement in the Ukraine crisis that really catches the eye. And what Victoria Nuland was doing was handpicking the government that was going to replace the elected government the US overthrew in 2014. That's what they were doing. And then from that point on, the US would flood Ukraine with weapons, send US troops into Ukraine to train Ukrainian forces, and repeat the exact same process they went through with Georgia before Georgia militarily attacked Russia. It's the exact same process. I'm going to spell it out anyway. So this is from 2019, extending Russia, competing from advantageous ground. This is from the Rand Corporation. This is a think tank funded in part by the US government itself. And in the report, which is available in PDF form for free from the Rand Corporation's website, one of the options, actually option one, provide lethal aid to Ukraine. It says the United States should increase its military assistance to Ukraine in terms of both the quantity and quality of weapons. Creating a genuine national security threat to Russia on its border. It also says the United States could also become more vocal in its support for NATO membership for Ukraine. So expanding this military alliance that has repeatedly destroyed other nations under false pretexts, expanding it up to Russia's border by bringing Ukraine in as a NATO member. That's what they're talking about doing. And then it explains expanding US assistance to Ukraine, including lethal military assistance, would likely increase the costs to Russia in both blood and treasure, killing Russians and forcing them to expend national resources, of holding the Donbas region. More Russian aid to the separatists and an additional Russian troop presence would likely be required, leading to larger expenditures, equipment losses, and Russian casualties. The latter could become quite controversial at home, as it did when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. So the Rand Corporation knows that supplying weapons to Ukraine will force Russia to react because Russia perceives it as a national security threat. And why wouldn't they? The US did the exact same thing in Georgia, and Georgia eventually militarily attacked Russia. They really had left Russia with absolutely no choice but to react to what was going on. The only choice that Russia had wasn't if there would be a war, it is when the war would take place. Would it take place when Russia had the military power and the economic ability to absorb the sanctions and fight this war against a relatively weaker Ukraine, or allow the United States to continue flooding the country with increasingly capable weapon systems and training more and more Ukrainian soldiers to use them? That was the only question that Moscow faced when making this decision. Now, I talked about China as well. I said China is helping Russia because China is being targeted by the exact same process. As a matter of fact, for China, it's even worse, and I'm going to explain how it's worse. Not only is the United States militarizing Taiwan and encouraging separatism in Taiwan, which the US officially recognizes as part of China. Not only are they doing that, they're already waging a proxy war against China all around the globe. Everywhere Chinese engineers go, the United States arms and backs militant groups, terrorists, to kill the engineers and destroy the infrastructure. We've heard the US repeatedly say they're going to challenge China's Belt and Road Initiative, building transportation corridors between China and its neighbors. The US is going to counter that with its own program of infrastructure building worldwide. Of course, the US has no ability to do that. So what are they really doing? They're really just arming and backing terrorists to kill Chinese engineers and destroy the infrastructure. So let's give you a few examples of this. This is Voice of America. 2018, suicide bomber attacks Chinese engineers in Pakistan. Police said that paramilitary forces were leading a search operation to look for suspected facilitators of the attack. A separatist group called the Baluchistan Liberation Army has claimed responsibility for the violence. So these Baluchistan separatists that the US was backing. How do you know that they're being backed by the US? I'll explain in just a moment. Here's France 24. This was just 2021. Deadly car bombing in Pakistan targets hotel hosting Chinese ambassadors. So these armed and backed separatists sponsored by the US killed Chinese engineers. They also tried to kill a Chinese diplomat. Now, this goes all the way back to 2011. There was this big drive in the US, including in Congress, to back a Baluchistan independence movement. This is from the National Interest Free Baluchistan, and they claim to counter Islamism in nuclear Pakistan, the United States should do more to support Baluch insurgents. They claim that these extremists are a threat because Pakistan has nuclear weapons. So their solution to this problem is to encourage separatism and basically a civil war in Pakistan, as if that would have a better outcome in terms of where these nuclear weapons ended up. At the very end of the article, though, they give up the game and they say, Pakistan has given China a base at Gwadar in the heart of Baluch territory, so an independent Baluchistan would serve U.S. strategic interests. And again, in Congress, there were efforts to support Baluchistan and the National Endowment for Democracy. Just as they were doing in Eastern Europe, they were also working with Baluch separatists to do exactly this, to counter China by backing violent extremists who would kill their engineers, target the infrastructure, and even try to kill their diplomats. Pakistan is not the only place the U.S. is doing this. They're also doing this in Myanmar in Southeast Asia, right next to Thailand, where I'm based. This is 2021. Chinese factories set on fire and at least 38 killed in Myanmar's deadliest day since coup. So the Myanmar military overthrew the U.S. client regime installed into power there through the exact same process explained by the New York Times and The Guardian. And the military overthrew them, and then the U.S. began backing this armed terrorist movement to try to reinstall the client regime into power. And as part of this violence, they are also deliberately targeting Chinese businesses and investments. This is the Irrawaddy. The Irrawaddy is actually funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, the U.S. government. This is from just last year. China-backed pipeline facility damaged in Myanmar resistance attack. When they say resistance attack, they mean these U.S.-backed terrorists trying to reinstall a U.S. client regime into power in Myanmar. And I just done a video about the Solomon Islands and how U.S.-backed opposition groups traveled to the capital, Honiara, and they tried to burn the capital down. This is Reuters. That is the damage they did. Explainer, what is behind unrest in the Solomon Islands? And if you read through this article, they talk about this group called Malaita for Democracy. They were the ones leading the violence. Just a year before that violence, looking at articles like this from Solomon Star, US-based institute consults with Malaita for Democracy, M4D. What organization? The International Republican Institute, IRI, based in Washington, D.C. That's who met this violent and also racist mob. That's who met them a year before they went to the Capitol to burn it down and to also target Chinese businesses there. So the U.S. is waging a proxy war on China already. They're killing Chinese people, engineers, citizens, businessmen. They're even trying to target and kill diplomats. They're destroying Chinese infrastructure all around the globe. They're doing it by proxy, but it's them doing it. It's the United States doing it, in addition to surrounding China militarily. They're doing a very similar process to Russia with NATO expansion, the political interference the Western media openly admits to. All along Russia's borders, within the borders of nations that are considered allies of Russia, Belarus, for example. And this is what Russia and China are reacting to individually and now also possibly collectively. So again, as we arrive at the 1-year mark for Russia's special military operation in Ukraine, it's really important not only to figure out what's going on now and where it may all be headed, it's very important to remember how this actually started and why. The real reason versus the propaganda that we're being told to paper over the US's role in starting all of this. It was the US and NATO who started this with Russia, and it's the United States deliberately targeting, antagonizing, encircling, and attempting to contain China that's going to provoke a response from China eventually. They are determined to cross the red lines of both Russia and China. They know they enjoy control over the media in the West and to a greater extent around the globe. They can provoke these nations. They can cover up the fact that they were behind the provocation, and they can depict the reaction as not an act of defense, but an act of aggression. So let's keep all of this information in mind. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Sharing especially, get the word out about all of this information. And if you make videos or you write articles, you're free to take any of this information and include it in your own articles and videos, and there's no need to even give me credit. We just need to get this information out there to people everywhere. They need to know what's really going on. I honestly believe if people know the truth, they will not go along with this agenda. And this is really on the footpath toward World War III. It really is. And it's going to upend all of our lives, no matter where we are. So please like and share. Think about subscribing. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. There is a huge number of resources, references that I included in the video description below. All of the links are in there, so please check for that. There's also ways you can help support my work. I don't monetize my YouTube channel. If an ad pops up, feel free to use an ad blocker or to just skip past the ad. It's not doing me any good. If you do want to support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee or Patreon. And to everyone who has been helping, whether it's one-time donations or month-to-month donations, or again, even if you're just sharing the work, that all helps out tremendously. I greatly appreciate that. So thank you again. And as always, thank you for watching.